Today we'll be talking about SAS If Then Else statements. We'll be looking at how to recode variables using either character or conditional statements in order to create new variables. Today's data set is called Lesson 5.SAS7bdat, which means that it is already a SAS data set. So when we read in this data set, we will be looking to use a set statement as part of our data step in order to read in the data set so that we can use it in SAS. So let's start with that step. I'm going to start a new data step. I'm going to call the new data set Lesson 5. Again, the data step starts with data and the new data set name, followed by the set statement. And then I'm going to get the path to my data set by clicking on the Explorer bar in the folder for my data set. I'm going to copy that and paste that path here and add the data set name to the end. Set statements always point to the data set name, just like that. I'm going to add my run, and we should see that when we run this code, we get a data set that has 49 observations, so 49 rows, and 9 variables, so 9 columns. We're going to take a look at that data set before we get started with our if then else statements to see what we're looking at. So we'll go into libraries and the work library, and here's the data set that we just created called Lesson 5. We'll open that data set. And today what we'll do is we'll be recoding gender. So we have several variables in here. We have the education for dad, the person's education for their mother, their gender, their IQ, their age, their GPA, whether or not they're a smoker, whether or not they're a drinker, and what their class or status in the university is. I want to use gender as our example for today. I want to recode gender so that females are 1 and males are 2. Now, a few things to notice about our gender variable before we get started. First, we have the character values for male and female, but notice that for female, we have some females that are spelled out with a lowercase f at the beginning, and some that begin with an uppercase F. We also have some missing values that we'll need to account for as we do our recoding. And these are all things to be aware of as we start writing our if then else statements. Let's go ahead and start a data step where we can do some of this recoding. Now on the website, they have you do your if then else coding often in conjunction with your dataset read-in functions. I don't do that, primarily because if something were to go wrong with the dataset read-in or the if then else statement, you wouldn't be able to easily locate and fix the problem that was caused. And so we're going to do our if then else as a separate data step, just to be on the safe side. We know that our dataset read-in has functioned. We can see that from our log. And so now we can go on to writing our if then else statements. So I'm going to create a new data set called Lesson 5a. Again, just so that I'm not overwriting my previous data set. This is so that if for some reason my if then else statement doesn't work and there's an error, it won't overwrite my old data set and I would have to read it in again. Let's start with the simplest possible case. So if all of our genders were appropriate formatted and we had no missing data, one way that we could code our if then else statement would be like this. We'll create a new variable called sex that's going to contain our new numeric variable for gender. In this case, what I'm telling SAS is that if our gender variable is equal to this value, then we set sex equal to 2, else sex is equal to 1. Again, this is the simplest case, assuming that everything looks correct. So if we run that code, we'll get a new data set. And if we open that, we'll see a few things. We do have males coded to 2, we have females coded to 1, but we've also coded those missing values. So that's not going to work for us in this case. So let's try a new way to do this. I'm going to start a new data step, and again, I'm just doing this for the purposes of example. You could also do all of these in the same data step, except that if you're coding into the same final variable, sex, you would need to be sure that you were recreating that variable each time. So let's try something a little more specific. So if gender equals male, then sex equals 2. Else, this is where our else if comes into play, gender equals female, then sex equals 1. So in this case, we're telling SAS very specifically, if gender equals male, then sex equals 2. Else, if gender equals female, then sex equals 1. Whenever you're operating with the same initial variable, in this case gender, and the same outcome variable, in this case sex, you would need the else if for every conditional statement after your first one. You want to tell SAS to read through these statements sequentially, and so you need to have the else if so that SAS knows that these two statements are related. Let's run this code and see what we get. Now if we created this new data set, lesson 5b, and we have now 2s for our males, we have 1s for some of our females, and we have missing where missing is appropriate. So we have no gender for this individual, and so we have a missing variable in terms of the new sex variable we've created. Now the problem is that SAS, when it is reading in and looking at this conditional statement, it's only looking for gender variables or gender values where female has a capital F. In order to have SAS code those other values for female that have the lowercase f, we actually have to tell SAS to do so. So let's try this one last time. And our statement for males stays the same. Now, when we're writing our statement for females, what we can do is tell SAS if gender equals capital F female, or gender equals lowercase f female. The or statement here tells SAS to look for either of these two conditions when setting this new variable to 1. So if we run this last statement, we will now see that the code for sex for males is 2, and for females it's 1, regardless of whether the female is the lowercase or the uppercase variable. So that's one way to appropriately recode gender into this new variable sex. You can also use and statements. So this or could be and, where we want to see both of these conditions apply. Now obviously the same condition can't apply to the same variable, but we can use that in conjunction with two variables. So for our last example, we're going to create a new data set from our original data set, and this time I want to code for students who both smoke and drink. If we go back to our original data set, we had a variable called smoker that was set to yes or no, and we had a variable called drinker that was set to yes or no. And so if we wanted to code for students who both smoke and drink, we could code it like this. If smoker equals yes and drinker equals yes, then bad health equals 1. Else, if smoker equals no, or drinker equals no, then bad health equals 0. In this case, this statement tells SAS that if these two variables are both yes, then we're going to set a new variable called bad health equal to 1. If either of those variables, using the OR statement, is equal to no, then we're going to set bad health equal to 0. If we run this code, it will create a new data set, and we'll see that we have this new variable where everyone is set equal to 0 unless they have both the yeses in those columns. And so that's another way to recode a new variable in order to determine whether someone is meeting certain criteria, certain conditional criteria. Now, in the slides that are part of this week's lesson, I've included a number of operators. You don't always have to use equals in these different conditions. If you're working with numeric variables, you also have the full array of less than, equal than, greater than, or less than, equal to, greater than, and all of the different conditionals you might use with related to numeric functions. Character comparisons typically function with the equals or not equals, and one thing to note is that when you're putting in these values, they need to match the SAS values in these cells exactly, which is why we see the difference when we do or do not include the lowercase and uppercase female. That's it for today's video. I'll post this code along with the video. Thank you.